So let me ask you a question, because recently it just came out into the news that several billionaires in the United States of America, like John Paulson, Warren Buffett, Soros, they're beginning to take all their money out of U.S. stocks. I think Buffett just got rid of about 19 million shares of Johnson and Johnson, and then you have Soros that's gotten rid of almost all of his bank stocks, including in J.P. Morgan Chase, Citigroup, and Goldman Sachs, which you just made mention of a minute ago. Is there something that they know that we should know?
Yes and no. They've got a playbook, and they think that they're going to make the markets crash. They think that the U.S. dollar is going to become worthless. They've got a whole scenario worked out.
Is that the direction that this super entity is trying to move our economy in right now? Are they trying to crash the U.S. dollar?
Yes, but I can tell you that their playbook isn't, they're not calling the shots. We have, and I'll tell you how I know this, because I was telling you about this very accurate model that this political scientist, Jacek Kugler, who chaired the political science department at Claremont. Anyway, this model predicted that if we could get a country to expose this corruption, just one, we would then have rule of law. And that country was the United Kingdom, but it's not just the United Kingdom. For example, I was a witness at the European Parliament in 2011. I have been contacting the Congress on this corruption for many, many years. Before I was fired in 2007, Senator Lugar wrote 3 letters to the World Bank saying, don't fire this lady. He was very disappointed when I was fired, because he knew very well when I went, before I went to the Congress, I stayed inside the World Bank, which is what a lawyer's supposed to do. I went up the corporate ladder. I went to the audit committee, which is when the Dutch government wrote a letter to the World Bank saying that they wanted the audit committee to look into the problem. Now, the French government, Pierre Duquesne, was then chairing the audit committee. And what Mr. Duquesne did was, instead of investigating the problem in the audit committee, he asked for there to be a study of something called the Institutional Integrity Department. That was the World Bank Anti-Corruption Department.
Right.
And so Paul Volcker came in, and what he did was he did a bogus study. You know, he did a study that's really more of a cover-up than a study. But in the meantime, all of the people that were working for the Institutional Integrity Department were trying to tell him what was really going on, and they were getting fired and intimidated. So there's a newspaper article. I don't know if you know Common Dreams, but Common Dreams has talked about what the people inside the Institutional Integrity Department were trying to tell Paul Volcker. And those people ultimately ended up getting compensated. But in the meantime, the Volcker panel study, which said that there was no corruption inside the World Bank, the U.S. kept pretending like everybody believed it. But what was actually going on was, at that point, there was a president of the World Bank, Paul Wolfowitz. And Paul Wolfowitz, when he came in and became president, he gave a huge pay raise to his girlfriend, Shaha Riza. And the board didn't like that. So they were firing Paul Wolfowitz, except that, do you remember what happened to Eliot Spitzer, the former governor of New York, who went to the New York Madam and then he had to step down?
Right.
Well, some of the executive directors, there's 25 of them, they represent the countries of the world. The biggest 8 economies each get their own executive director. So that's Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Japan. I'm missing one. But anyway, then the rest of the countries share executive directors. And these executive directors were being blackmailed because some of them had gone to the New York Madam. Some of them had spent money in their bank accounts that made them vulnerable. And I found out about this because in addition to having studied law at Yale Law School, I studied economics at the University of Amsterdam, and I speak Dutch. And I happened to be in Holland when the representative of the Dutch government, Herman Wijfels, mentioned that the board was being blackmailed. And then the next day, his predecessor, who was named Ad Melkert, and Ad at that point had left the World Bank board and was working at the United Nations Development Program. Anyway, Ad went on a television show in Holland, and they asked him, they said, Ad, were you being blackmailed too? And he said, well, I'm a boring guy. He said, but I knew other people on the board, and they certainly were very upset at this. So I came home, and I went to, first I went back to the Senate, and Senator Lugar's staff said that I should go to the Treasury Department. So I went to Kenneth Peale. I also wrote the dean of the Yale Law School. I said, have you lost your mind? You cannot be blackmailing other countries' diplomats like this, especially when this is not even a security interest, that Paul Wolfowitz should be free to give a pay raise to his girlfriend. How is this something in the national interest that you should be blackmailing other countries' ambassadors? I said, this is going to come home to roost. And I had spoken with Chuck Hagel, who was then the senator of Nebraska, and I was telling him how this model was warning us that we were going to lose our leadership. We were going to lose something called the Gentleman's Agreement, which was an agreement that the president of the World Bank would always be appointed by the United States. Just anybody we wanted, we said it, we'd get it. And the same thing for Europe. They would get the managing director of the IMF, International Monetary Fund. Now, these two organizations, they look like they're separate, but they're really, for all practical purposes, they're just two sides of the same coin. They have the same board of governors. That's the ministers of finance or the ministers of development from all of the 188 countries. Those people come together twice a year. And then you've got the board that's resident. And I said it's very clear that the way the rules work inside the World Bank, and because of this analysis that I had on rule of law, I said we're going to lose our leadership position. And I was so certain that that warning was going to be enough. But because of what I was telling you about the super entity, the cabal, that's actually hijacked the World Bank. But guess what? It hijacked the United States government. It hijacked a lot of other countries' governments. And that's what's actually happened.
Multi-level corruption that you were looking at. So while you were in the World Bank and you're seeing this multi-level corruption going on, did anybody offer you a hand in the Ponzi scheme?
Well, it's only relatively recently that people have started offering me anything. And every time that happens, it's not that I'm uncorruptible. It's that I have a big mouth. And so they'll offer me something that, sort of looks attractive. But before I know it, I'm telling somebody else about the fact that I've been offered this incredible bribe. And so it just doesn't work.
Right. Well,
and you have to also recognize what happened to the presidents that didn't want this Federal Reserve System to go forward. Let me explain how it works, okay? If you have the Treasury Department that's issuing the currency, then you don't have to pay interest on it. But if you have the Treasury Department issue a promissory note to the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve then issues the currency, then this note that the Treasury Department issued, there's interest on it. And that's how the debt every year gets bigger and bigger, because we're going to be spending more money than we're taking in. And let me tell you how the tax payments work. Okay. This I couldn't believe in the beginning, but it's absolutely true. When you fill out your taxes and you send a check one place and you send the tax form another place, the check that you send goes directly to the Federal Reserve, and they take that check and they send it to the United Kingdom, and the UK keeps, not the government, the UK banksters keep 40%, and then they send 60% onto the Jesuits in the Vatican. That's what's happening to our tax dollars.
Wow.
Now, how are we financing our government? We're selling drugs. We're selling the drugs that we grow in Afghanistan. We never had any poppies there until the war in Afghanistan. You think with all the satellites flying over, they couldn't see where the poppy fields are? No, that's how we earn our money.
Wow.
How does that grab you? Is that a good arrangement?
Wow.
No, it's not a good arrangement.
So are you basically saying that the money that's being fed into the IRS ends up at the Vatican?
60% of it, except for the 40% cut that goes to the United Kingdom. Now, let me tell you how that happened. That happened because in 1200, the King of England borrowed a lot of money from the Vatican because of wars and signed a treaty that he would agree to keep repaying the money to the Vatican. And of course, he never caught up. So he was in trouble. And then, do you remember when our Capitol building was burned down in 1812 by the UK?
Right.
Yeah. Okay. We have been having to pay war reparations to the United Kingdom all these years, and nobody has bothered to tell the people about it. And Lincoln, when he was financing the Civil War, issued greenbacks directly without involving the bankers. That's why he was rubbed out. And JFK, he had a memo that he was going to sign where he was going to just erase this compounding of interest on the U.S. debt. He was going to have our currency issued directly by the Treasury Department. He was assassinated 11 days after he signed that memo. So these banksters are bound and determined to keep us, you know, what can I say, imprisoned in debt, except that it's not working, because what we've done is we've alerted all the countries of the world. I have written to the ambassadors of all these countries many, many times. I've written to, in Washington and in New York, I wrote them a letter a couple of months ago where I was telling them about the fact that their ambassadors were all being blackmailed when they tried to fire Paul Wolfowitz. So the whole world is laughing at the fact that the American public is totally in the dark and duped by their media that refuse to tell them what's really happening.
Now, I certainly want you to elaborate a little bit more on a specific point that you just made, and I took you back to it a second ago, and that's the fact that our tax dollars, you're saying 60% of our tax dollars get cut to the Vatican and the Jesuits. And I think for a lot of people out there, that's a pretty astounding revelation, because, you think of the Jesuits, we have Pope Francis now, whom our president praises, and he's the very first Jesuit pope. And some people, when they think of the Jesuits, they think of an order of meek and humble men and all of these things. Why would the Vatican and the Jesuits be, caught up in such a stink like this? What in your perception, and what is their worldview? Are they a bunch of megalomaniacs? Are they just trying to amass a stupendous amount of wealth? What do you perceive in this whole situation for the Jesuits in the Vatican?
I'm so sorry to have to tell you. First of all, let me start out by saying that this has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with the Catholic faith. Mm-hmm. This has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with the people of faith that are not aware of this.
That's right.
And I have to tell you that there are, unfortunately, people who will mock the faith, and they will put on the priest's garb just so that they can hide their crimes. These are criminals. These are not Catholics. Wow. And unfortunately, there are many of them at the very top. It's rot at the top. Wow. And that's the way it is, and it's been documented. And I've been working with people who have documented this. It's been going on for a very, very long time. You can read what our founding fathers had to say about the Jesuits. After Lincoln was assassinated, the Jesuits were not allowed certain things, certain privileges in the United States. And that ban on the Jesuits was lifted by Ronald Reagan, unfortunately.